There is a mountain on the border of modern Lebanon and Syria where, according to a book that almost didn't survive into our century, heaven broke its own rules. The book says that 200 angels stood on its summit in the ancient world, before any flood had ever touched the earth, and made a pact with each other. Not with God, with each other. They swore an oath, one by one, binding themselves to a decision they could not undo, and then they came down from that mountain and walked among human beings. What happened next, according to this old and strange text, is the real reason the world was destroyed by water. Not human wickedness alone. Something else. Something that mixed heaven and earth in a way it was never supposed to mix, and left behind creatures the book calls giants, born of angels and human mothers, who grew so large and so hungry that they began to consume everything around them, including, the text says, each other. This is not a story I am making up for effect. There is a real book behind it, a real and physical set of manuscripts, copied by monks in a mountain kingdom in East Africa for over 1,000 years while the rest of the world forgot it existed, and then found again, piece by piece, in ways almost as strange as the story it tells. Tonight, I want to walk you through both of those stories together. The ancient tale the book preserves, and the true history of how it came to survive at all. But before we go there, get comfortable. Because we have a long, quiet night of history ahead of us. Hey buddy, welcome back to the quiet past. If this is your first time here, this channel is a place to slow down at the end of the day, listen to true history told gently, and let your mind drift off somewhere in the middle of it, which is exactly what it's meant to do. I'm not here to give you jump scares or dramatic music stings. I'm here to sit with you, like an old friend by a low fire, and tell you what we actually know about one of the strangest documents to survive from the ancient world and the flood story that grew up around it. So go ahead and get settled. Turn the lights down if you haven't already. Pull the blanket up. If you're listening from a bed in Ohio, or a couch in Manchester, or a truck cab somewhere on a highway in the middle of the night, or a quiet apartment in Manila where the sun might already be coming up, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are right now. Drop it in the comments if you feel like it. No pressure at all. I read them, even the ones that come in at 3 in the morning your time, which honestly might be most of you. And if you find yourself enjoying this kind of slow, honest history, told without any rush, consider subscribing. It costs nothing. It helps this little channel keep going, and it means more of these will find their way to you on nights just like this one. That's the only thing I'll ask of you tonight. Now let's turn the lights down a little further and go back. Back before Babylon, before Egypt built its first pyramid, to a world the Book of Enoch says was already going wrong. The world before the water. I want you to imagine a morning, thousands of years before anyone had thought to write anything down. There is no way to give this morning an exact date. The people we are about to meet lived in what scholars sometimes call the deep past, a stretch of human history so early that we only have scattered fragments to reconstruct it from, bits of bone, grains of pollen preserved in lake mud, stone tools worn smooth by hands that have been dust for longer than anyone can comfortably imagine. But the book we're exploring tonight, the Book of Enoch, places its story in this hazy, half-remembered era, the 10 generations between the first man and the flood, and it asks us to picture ordinary human life going on inside it, the way ordinary life always does, no matter how strange the sky gets. So picture a valley. Somewhere in the region we would now call the Fertile Crescent, that wide crescent of land curving from the Persian Gulf up through modern Iraq and Syria, and down into the Levant, the part of the world where wheat first learned to grow in rows instead of scattered wild across the hills. The air in the early morning is cool, almost cold, because deserts and semi-arid valleys lose their heat quickly once the sun goes down, and it hasn't fully come back up yet. Smoke is already rising from a cluster of low dwellings, some made of mud brick, some little more than reed and packed earth, roofs flat, and used as much for sleeping in summer as anything else. A woman crouches by a fire pit dug into the floor of her home, feeding it with dried dung and brush because wood is precious here and not to be wasted on cooking fires when it's needed for tools and roof beams. The smoke curls up through a hole in the roof, catching the very first gray light, and if you stood close enough, you'd smell that particular mix of burning dung and roasting grain that would have been the actual, everyday smell of home for most people who ever lived before the modern age, whether they lived in Enoch's era or 3,000 years after it. It is not a pleasant smell to our noses now. It was simply the smell of morning to them. Outside, a man is already moving toward the fields, barefoot or in simple leather sandals, carrying a wooden hoe or a stone sickle if the season calls for harvest. The Book of Genesis, which sits right alongside the world Enoch describes, tells us that after the first humans were driven from the garden, the ground itself became something to struggle with, thorns and thistles, food only by the sweat of the brow. Whatever we make of that story theologically, it captures something historically real about early farming life. It was punishing work. Fields had to be cleared by hand. Water had to be carried or, if you were lucky enough to live near one of the great rivers, directed through small channels dug with nothing but wooden tools and human effort. A single bad season, a flood at the wrong time or a drought at the wrong time, could mean real hunger by winter. And yet, alongside that hardship, there was a rhythm to things that we've almost entirely lost in the modern world. Life moved by the sun and the seasons, not by a clock. People woke with the light and slept not long after dark, because oil for lamps was expensive and firewood had better uses. Families were large, not out of sentiment but out of necessity, because more hands meant more work could get done and more chance that someone would survive to care for you in old age. Children learned their parents' trades by watching and doing, not by sitting in a room being taught out of a book, because there were no books yet, not in the way we mean the word. Knowledge passed from mouth to mouth, generation to generation, and if something wasn't remembered and repeated, it could simply vanish. I find it worth pausing on, every time I come back to this period, just how different a human life would have felt back then. No maps beyond what a person could walk in a season. No sense of a wider world beyond rumors carried by traders or wanderers. The stars overhead would have been the same stars we see tonight, but without a single electric light anywhere on Earth to compete with them. The sky itself must have felt enormous, close, almost participatory in daily life, the way it does today only in the very darkest, most remote places left on the planet. When the Book of Enoch describes angels coming down and looking at the daughters of men, and when it describes the sky itself as a kind of layered structure with gates the sun and moon pass through, it's worth remembering that the people who first told and retold this story were people who watched that sky every single night of their lives, without exception, because there was nothing else to look at once the fire burned low. Now, into this world, the Book of Enoch places its central human figure before he becomes central to the story we're building toward tonight, and that is a man named Enoch himself, the great-grandfather, several generations back, of a man named Noah, whom you certainly already know. But before we get to Enoch the man, I want you to sit with this ordinary picture a little longer, because everything that follows, the angels, the giants, the flood, gains its full weight only when we remember it was happening, according to the story, to people exactly like the ones I've just described. Farmers, mothers nursing infants by firelight, old men who remembered stories from their own grandfathers about how the world had been made, children playing in dust yards with toys carved from wood or bone. Let's go inside one of these homes for a moment, because there's something about stepping across a threshold that makes history feel real in a way that facts and dates alone never quite manage. The doorway is low, low enough that a grown adult would need to duck slightly, not because people were dramatically shorter then, though average heights were somewhat lower due to diet, but because building a taller doorway meant more labor and more heat lost in winter. Inside, your eyes would need a moment to adjust, because the only light comes from that low fire and whatever manages to slip through the smoke hole above. The floor is packed earth, swept but never truly clean by our standards, and along one wall there might be a raised platform of mud brick or packed clay, used for sleeping, covered in woven reed mats and whatever animal skins the family had managed to cure. The air smells of smoke, of the animals that likely share part of the living space during cold nights, goats or sheep whose body heat was a genuine, practical source of warmth, and of the grain that's stored in large ceramic jars against one wall, because keeping seed and food dry and away from vermin was one of the great unglamorous struggles of ancient domestic life. A woman grinds grain between two flat stones, a task so physically demanding and so constant that archaeologists studying skeletons from this general era and region have found that women's arm bones from grinding grain show wear patterns similar to modern athletes. This wasn't an occasional chore. It happened daily, sometimes twice a day, because flour didn't keep well and bread needed to be made fresh. I want you to imagine the sound of that grinding, a low, steady, scraping rhythm that would have been one of the most constant background sounds of ancient domestic life, present in nearly every home, nearly every morning, for thousands of years before anyone thought to build a mill that didn't require human muscle to turn it. Outside, you might hear goats bleating as they're let out to graze on whatever scrub the land provides, and somewhere further off, the low murmur of men's voices as they gather to walk out to the fields together, because farming this way of life was rarely a solitary task. Cooperation was survival. If your neighbor's harvest failed and yours didn't, you were expected to share, because next season the situation might reverse, and a community that didn't practice this kind of mutual aid simply didn't last very long in a world with no safety net beyond your neighbors and your own stored grain. It's easy, when we tell stories about ancient angels and giants, to let the strangeness of the supernatural elements crowd out this ordinary human texture. But the Book of Enoch itself, and the flood story that follows it in Genesis, are deeply concerned with exactly this kind of everyday life, because part of what both texts are trying to explain is how something as ordinary and repeated as human daily existence, marrying, working, eating, raising children, could have gone wrong on such an enormous scale that it required, in the story's own telling, a complete and devastating reset. So let's slow down here for a moment and think about how strange that claim really is. Nearly every culture that has left behind written records from the ancient Near East has some version of a great flood story. The Mesopotamians told of a flood sent by the god Enlil, preserved for us in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a man named Utnapishtim builds a boat and survives. Earlier still, a Sumerian text describes a king named Ziusudra doing much the same thing. The ancient Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving a flood sent by Zeus. This is one of the most widespread story patterns in the ancient world, appearing across cultures that had little to no direct contact with one another, and historians and folklorists have puzzled over that pattern for well over a century now. Some point to actual, dramatic flooding events in the ancient Near East, catastrophic and memorable enough, particularly around the Black Sea region or the lower Mesopotamian floodplain, to embed themselves in cultural memory and grow into legend over centuries of retelling. Others point out that flooding disasters were simply common and terrifying enough, in a world without flood control infrastructure, that many cultures independently developed similar stories to make sense of similarly destructive experiences. What makes the Hebrew tradition unusual, and what makes the Book of Enoch even more unusual within that tradition, is the specific reason it gives for why the flood happened. It isn't simply that humanity had become violent or wicked in some general, unspecified way, though the text says that too. The Book of Enoch gives us something far stranger and far more specific. It tells us that a group of angelic beings, called the Watchers in the text, looked down at human women and decided they wanted them for wives. And it tells us they didn't just want them. They came down and took them, and in doing so, set into motion a chain of consequences that the book describes in more vivid, unsettling, and oddly domestic detail than almost anything else that survives from this period of ancient religious literature. I want to spend real time with that story tonight, slowly, the way it deserves, because it's one of the strangest and most genuinely under-discussed pieces of ancient literature still available to us. But before we descend that mountain with the Watchers, I think it's worth understanding who Enoch was supposed to be in the first place, this man whose name the book carries, and why later generations, particularly in one small corner of the ancient and medieval world, decided his supposed writings were worth preserving at all, copying by hand, generation after generation, long after the rest of the world had let them fade into obscurity. Let's go there next. The man who walked with God. The Bible tells us almost nothing about Enoch, which is part of what makes the whole story of his book so strange. If you open the book of Genesis and read through the 5th chapter, you'll find what's sometimes called the genealogy of Adam, a long, steady list of names, each one living, having children and dying, generation after generation, in a kind of solemn rhythm. Adam lived 930 years and he died. Seth lived 912 years and he died. Enosh lived 905 years and he died. On and on it goes, name after name, each life a brief entry in a much longer record, until we reach a man named Enoch, and the pattern breaks. The text says Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of a son named Methuselah. Then it says something it says of no one else on the list. It says Enoch walked with God. Not simply that he lived a long time and died like everyone before him, but that he walked with God for 300 years after his son was born. And then, in the King James phrasing that has echoed through English-speaking culture for 4 centuries now, he was not, for God took him. That's it. That's the entire biblical account of Enoch's life. A handful of verses, 5 in total, and a single, deeply strange detail sitting right at the center of them. He did not die the way everyone else in that long genealogy died. He walked with God, and then he was simply taken. I want you to imagine how strange that sentence must have sounded to the earliest people who heard it read aloud, likely around a fire much like the ones we've already imagined tonight, in a culture that had no concept of a peaceful, natural death as anything other than the expected end for every human being, no matter how righteous. Death was universal. It was the one certainty. And here, buried in an otherwise unremarkable list of ancestors, was a man for whom that certainty simply didn't apply. It's not hard to understand why later generations, faced with a gap that tantalizing, felt compelled to fill it in. What had Enoch actually done during those 300 years of walking with God? Where had he been taken, and why him specifically, out of everyone in that long line of names? By the time we reach the last few centuries before the birth of Christ, a period scholars now generally call the Second Temple period, referring to the time after the Jewish temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt following the Babylonian exile, we start finding actual written texts that attempt to answer exactly those questions. Texts that claim to be Enoch's own account of what he saw and heard during those centuries of walking with God. This collection of texts is what we now call the Book of Enoch, though it's worth pausing on that name for a moment, because it isn't really one single book in the way we'd normally use that word. It's a compilation, likely written by several different hands over a span of a few centuries, roughly between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after, and later gathered together into a single work. Scholars typically break it into 5 major sections. There's the Book of the Watchers, which is the part we'll be spending most of tonight exploring, describing the fall of the angels and the origin of the giants. There's the Book of Parables, sometimes called the Similitudes, which contains some of the most theologically debated material in the whole collection, including early descriptions of a heavenly figure called the Son of Man. There's an astronomical book, which lays out an elaborate calendar system based on the movements of the sun and moon, reflecting real ancient interest in tracking time accurately for agricultural and religious purposes. There's a book of dream visions, and finally an epistle of Enoch, containing ethical teaching and warnings addressed to future generations. None of this material made it into the Hebrew Bible as it was eventually finalized, and none of it made it into the standard Protestant or Catholic Old Testament either. For most of Western religious history, in fact, the Book of Enoch existed only as a kind of rumor, a text mentioned by ancient writers but genuinely unavailable to read, its actual contents lost to Europe for well over 1,000 years. And this is where the true history becomes, in its own quiet way, almost as remarkable as the ancient story itself. While European Christianity was losing track of the Book of Enoch almost entirely, treating it as a curiosity mentioned by early church writers but no longer worth preserving, one branch of Christianity never let it go. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, tracing its roots back to the earliest centuries of the faith, and operating largely independent of the doctrinal battles and canon decisions being made in Rome and Constantinople, kept the Book of Enoch as part of its own scriptural canon. Monks in the highlands of Ethiopia copied it by hand, generation after generation, in an ancient liturgical language called Ge'ez, treating it not as a forgotten curiosity but as genuine, authoritative scripture, worthy of the same careful, reverent copying given to the books of Moses or the Psalms. Think about what that actually required, practically speaking, across more than 1,000 years. Every single copy of this text that survived did so because a human being, almost certainly a monk working by candlelight or the light of an oil lamp in a stone monastery, sat with an existing copy in front of him and reproduced it, letter by letter, onto fresh parchment made from treated animal skin, using ink mixed by hand from soot and gum and water. A single mistake, a smudge, a page damaged by damp or insects or fire, and that particular lineage of the text could be lost forever, dependent entirely on whether another surviving copy existed somewhere else to be copied from in turn. This was the actual, physical, unglamorous mechanism by which ancient texts survived at all before the invention of the printing press, and it is genuinely remarkable, when you sit with it, that the Book of Enoch made that journey successfully across more than a millennium, in a mountain kingdom largely cut off from the rest of Christian Europe, while the rest of the Christian and Jewish world had all but forgotten it existed. For the wider Western world, that changed in the late 18th century, and it changed because of a Scottish traveler named James Bruce. Bruce was, by most accounts, a genuinely remarkable and somewhat larger-than-life figure, a tall, forceful Scottish laird who spent years traveling through Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia in the 1760s and 70s, driven partly by scientific curiosity, and partly, it seems fair to say, by a considerable appetite for adventure and personal glory. He is most famous in his own era for claiming, controversially, to have discovered the source of the Blue Nile, a claim that was met with real skepticism back in Britain, in part because his travel accounts, when he eventually published them, struck many of his contemporaries as simply too colorful, too full of dramatic incident to be entirely believed. But whatever we make of Bruce's more theatrical claims, we know for certain that during his time in Ethiopia, he acquired at least 3 manuscript copies of the Book of Enoch, written in Ge'ez, and brought them back to Europe with him in 1773. For the first time in well over 1,000 years, scholars in Britain and continental Europe had physical access to the actual text that ancient writers had referenced, but that no one in the West had been able to read directly for generations. It still took a remarkably long time for that text to become genuinely available to ordinary readers, though. The manuscript sat, for the most part, in academic and ecclesiastical libraries for decades, slowly being studied by a small handful of scholars capable of reading Ge'ez itself, a specialized and fairly obscure area of linguistic expertise even among biblical scholars. It wasn't until 1821 that an English translation was finally published by a scholar named Richard Lawrence, and it wasn't until the early 20th century, in 1912, that a more thorough and widely used English translation appeared, produced by a scholar named R.H. Charles, whose translation is still, even now, more than a century later, one of the versions most commonly read by English-speaking audiences encountering the text for the first time. And then, in 1947, something happened that gave this whole story one more remarkable turn. In caves near the Dead Sea, in what is now the West Bank, a series of ancient manuscripts began coming to light, first discovered, according to the most widely told version of events, by a young Bedouin shepherd searching for a lost goat. These manuscripts, which came to be known collectively as the Dead Sea Scrolls, turned out to be an enormous cache of Jewish religious texts dating back to roughly the last few centuries before Christ, hidden away, most scholars believe, by a community living near the site of Qumran, possibly to protect them during periods of political and military upheaval in the region. Among the fragments recovered from these caves were pieces of the Book of Enoch, written not in Ge'ez this time, but in Aramaic, a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew and widely spoken across the ancient Near East, including, according to the New Testament, the everyday language spoken by Jesus of Nazareth himself. These Aramaic fragments, though incomplete and often damaged, gave scholars something they hadn't had before, a way to check the Ethiopian text against material far closer to whatever the original composition might have looked like, written in a language much closer to the presumed original than the Ge'ez translation that had preserved the text for so many centuries. What the Dead Sea Scroll fragments confirmed, broadly speaking, was that the Ethiopian monks had done their job with real fidelity across all those centuries of hand copying. The core content matched. The strange, vivid story of angels descending to earth, of giants born from that union, of a coming judgment by flood, wasn't a medieval invention or a later corruption. It was genuinely ancient, genuinely part of the same broad world of Jewish religious thought and imagination that produced so much of the Hebrew Bible itself. I find something quietly moving in that whole sequence of events, honestly, when I sit with it the way we're sitting with it tonight. A text nearly lost to most of the world, kept alive for over 1,000 years by patient, largely anonymous hands in a mountain kingdom in East Africa, brought back into wider awareness almost by accident by a restless Scottish adventurer, and then confirmed as authentically ancient by fragments hidden in desert caves and found, according to legend, by a boy chasing a stray goat. History rarely hands us a clean, simple story about how anything survives. Usually it's closer to this, a long chain of coincidence and devotion and sheer luck, any single link of which broken would have meant we never got to have this conversation at all tonight. So now that we know how the book survived, let's turn to what it actually says. Let's go back to that mountain I mentioned at the very beginning, the one where 200 angels are said to have gathered, looking down at the world of ordinary farmers and mothers and grinding stones. We spent our first chapter imagining, and made a decision that the Book of Enoch says changed the course of human history entirely. The Watchers on the Mountain. Let's go inside the story itself now, the way the Book of Enoch tells it. According to the text, in the days when human beings had multiplied across the earth, and beautiful daughters had been born to them, a group of angelic beings the book calls the Watchers looked down from heaven and saw those daughters, and desired them. The text doesn't dwell on abstract theology here. It describes something closer to a plan, deliberate and collective, among a specific group of angels, and it names their leader as Shemiheza. I want you to imagine, for a moment, what it would have meant to the people who first told and heard this story to picture angels as beings capable of desire and choice in this way. In much of later Christian tradition, angels are often imagined as purely obedient, almost mechanical in their devotion to God, incapable of the kind of independent will that leads to sin. But the angels of the Book of Enoch, and honestly the angels of a good deal of ancient Jewish thought more broadly, are something closer to a heavenly court, individuals with real agency, capable of loyalty and also capable of rebellion, much the way a human court might contain both faithful servants and ambitious conspirators. Shemiheza, the text tells us, is afraid to act alone. He worries that if he descends to earth and does this thing by himself, he alone will bear the guilt for it. So he gathers the other Watchers, 200 of them in total, and proposes something remarkable. He asks them to bind themselves together with an oath, so that the responsibility and the consequence will belong to all of them equally, and none can simply blame the others or walk away afterward. They agree, and the text tells us precisely where this happened. It names the place as Mount Hermon, a real mountain, still standing today on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, its peak often capped with snow well into the warmer months, visible for a considerable distance across the surrounding lowlands. The name itself, in the text, is given a kind of grim wordplay, connected to a Hebrew root suggesting a curse or a binding oath, as though the mountain's very name preserved the memory of what was sworn there. I find it worth sitting with the fact that this is a real, physical place, one you could travel to and stand on today, snow and rock and pine forest, not some vague or symbolic otherworldly location. Ancient storytellers across many cultures frequently anchored their most extraordinary claims to real, identifiable geography, and I think there's something genuinely important in that choice. It tells us something about how these stories functioned for the people who told them. They weren't meant to feel like distant fables set in a placeless nowhere. They were meant to feel like they had happened here in the actual mappable world, on a mountain a person could look up at from certain valleys in the region and think quietly to themselves, that is where it happened. 200 angels descend, the text tells us, and one by one it gives us their names. Shemiheza, their leader, Arakiel, Ramiel, Cockabeel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakiel, Asael, Armaros, Baderel, Aninel, Zachiel, Samsapeel, Saderel, Tirel, Yamiel, Sariel. The list goes on, 20 names given in total for the leaders among the 200, each one a small, specific detail that suggests this story was not treated casually by the people who preserved it. This wasn't a vague folk memory of angels behaving badly in some general sense. It was, to whoever compiled these lists, something closer to a historical record, precise enough to warrant names, ranks, and a specific mountain. Among all these names, one in particular carries far more weight in the story than the others, and that is Asael, more commonly rendered in most English translations as Azazel, a name you may actually recognize if you've spent any time reading the Book of Leviticus, where it appears in connection with the ritual of the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement, a goat symbolically burdened with the sins of the community and sent out into the wilderness to Azazel. Scholars have long debated exactly what that biblical ritual originally meant, and whether it drew directly on the same tradition preserved in Enoch, or whether both texts were drawing on some older, shared piece of ancient, Near Eastern religious imagination. But the connection is striking enough that it's hard to set aside entirely, and it gives Azazel a kind of double life across ancient Jewish literature, present in both the strange, expansive narrative of Enoch and the far more restrained, ritual language of Leviticus. According to the Book of Enoch, Azazel becomes something close to the chief instigator of what happens next, not merely in the matter of marriage and children, but in something the text treats as, if anything, even more dangerous, the teaching of forbidden knowledge to human beings. We'll spend real time on that in a moment. But first, let's stay with the descent itself, and with the human families who, according to this story, were about to have their lives upended by beings they had no framework for understanding at all. Imagine this for a moment. You are a woman living in one of those valleys we pictured earlier, going about an entirely ordinary day grinding grain, tending a small garden plot, watching your children play in the dust outside your home. You have no concept of angels descending from some other layer of reality, because that concept, as later generations would come to understand it, doesn't fully exist yet in the way we might imagine it. What you understand is the world in front of you, the fields, the animals, the neighbors, the sky, and the vague, half-remembered stories your grandparents told about how everything came to be. And then, according to the story the Book of Enoch preserves, beings unlike anything in that familiar world begin appearing among the human population. Not gently, not as distant, mysterious visitors glimpsed once and gone. The text describes the watchers taking human wives, in the same blunt, practical language the rest of Genesis uses to describe ordinary marriage, and it tells us the result of those unions were children unlike any children ever born before. The book calls them the Nephilim, a word that appears also, briefly and without much explanation, in the 6th chapter of Genesis itself, where it's often translated simply as giants. And the Book of Enoch, unlike Genesis, doesn't leave us with just a single word and no elaboration. It describes these children growing at an unnatural, almost horrifying pace, far beyond anything an ordinary human infancy would allow, until they towered over their human mothers and the rest of the human population entirely. We'll spend real time with what happens to those children and to the world around them in a little while. But first, I want us to sit with what the Book of Enoch says happened alongside all of this marrying and childbearing, because in many ways, this second thread of the story, the transfer of forbidden knowledge from the Watchers to humanity, is treated by the text as being just as consequential, and perhaps even more corrosive to the fabric of ordinary human life than the giants themselves. Let's go there next, into what these angels are said to have actually taught the people among whom they had come to live, what the angels taught. If the story stopped at marriage and unusual children, it would already be strange enough. But the Book of Enoch adds a second layer to what the Watchers did, and it's this second layer that seems to trouble the text's ancient authors the most, if we judge by how much space they give it and how sharply they condemn it. The book tells us that Azazel taught human beings to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, along with the metalworking skill required to produce them, and that he showed them how to extract precious metals from the earth and work them into ornaments, and how to apply various substances to darken the eyes and adorn the body, in ways the text treats as connected to vanity, seduction, and a general unraveling of simple, honest human life. Other Watchers, the text says, taught different things entirely. One taught the cutting of roots and the properties of plants, an early form of what we might now call herbal medicine or pharmacology, knowledge that in other hands might have been genuinely valuable, easing suffering and treating illness, but which the text frames here as corrupted by the circumstances of its transmission. Another taught the signs of the sun, moon, and stars, an early form of astrology, the practice of reading the heavens for guidance about human affairs, and another taught the observation of clouds and atmospheric signs, likely an early attempt at something like meteorology, forecasting weather from visible patterns in the sky, a skill that would have been genuinely useful to a farming community trying to time a planting or a harvest correctly. I want to pause here, because I think it's worth asking a question the text itself doesn't fully answer for us. Why would knowledge like herbal medicine, or whether observation, be treated as dangerous, corrupting, forbidden? On the surface, these sound like exactly the kinds of practical skills that would have made ancient human life meaningfully easier and safer. The best explanation historians and scholars of ancient religion have offered is that the danger, in the logic of this text, isn't really located in the knowledge itself. It's located in where the knowledge came from, and in what it represented about the proper order of things. In the worldview reflected across most of ancient Israelite and early Jewish religious thought, human beings were meant to receive wisdom and guidance from God, through prophets, through covenant, through the slow, patient accumulation of tradition passed faithfully from one generation to the next. Knowledge that instead arrived suddenly, from rebellious angels who had abandoned their proper place in the created order specifically to deliver it, represented something closer to theft than to gift. It was wisdom stolen from its proper channel and smuggled into the world through a broken doorway. And the text seems to suggest that knowledge obtained this way carries a kind of corruption with it, regardless of its practical usefulness, simply because of the illegitimate way it entered the world. There's a detail in this section of the text that I find genuinely striking, and it concerns metalworking specifically. The book connects the teaching of weapon making directly to an escalation of human violence, telling us that once people had access to swords and the skill to use them, warfare and bloodshed increased dramatically across the earth. Whether or not we take this as a literal historical claim, it captures something that archaeologists studying the actual transition from stone tool technology to bronze and eventually iron working across the ancient Near East have long recognized as broadly accurate. The development of metalworking over the actual centuries in which it unfolded across this region really did coincide with an increase in the scale and lethality of organized human violence. Stone tools can certainly kill, but bronze and iron weapons, produced by specialists using knowledge and resources not every household could access, changed the character of warfare, making it more organized, more devastating, and increasingly tied to power structures capable of controlling the production of weapons in the first place. The Book of Enoch, writing centuries after these actual technological shifts had already reshaped ancient warfare, seems to be reaching backward, trying to explain a real and remembered escalation in human violence by locating its origin in a single, dramatic, mythic moment, rather than in the slow, uneven, centuries-long process that archaeology actually shows us. Something similar might be said about the teaching connected to cosmetics and personal adornment. It's tempting for a modern audience, reading this section without context, to hear an old-fashioned suspicion of women's beauty practices, and there's likely some of that present, reflecting attitudes about female vanity common across much of the ancient world. But I think there's also something more specific going on. The text seems concerned, throughout this whole section, with a general blurring of boundaries between heaven and earth, between what belongs properly to angels and what belongs properly to humans, between the natural, unadorned human body and one enhanced or altered through applied knowledge and technique. In this framework, cosmetics aren't dangerous because beauty itself is dangerous, but because they represent one more instance of the same underlying problem, boundaries that were meant to stay fixed becoming fluid and permeable in ways the text's authors found deeply unsettling. Let's slow down and imagine what all of this might have actually looked like, on the ground, in one of those farming villages we pictured earlier. Imagine a blacksmith's forge appearing in a settlement that had never had one before, the ring of hammer on hot metal becoming a new and unfamiliar sound in the daily soundscape of the village, alongside the grinding stones and the bleating goats, and the low murmur of conversation around cooking fires. Imagine the first time a farmer, who had spent his entire life working the earth with wooden tools and stone blades, held an iron sickle in his hands and felt how much more efficiently it cut through stalks of grain. Imagine the mixture of wonder and unease that discovery might have produced, the sense that something had changed, permanently and irreversibly, in the texture of daily life, even before anyone fully understood the deeper consequences of that change. Imagine, too, a young woman in that same village hearing, for the first time, about a way of darkening her eyes or adorning her skin that hadn't existed among her mother's generation, and feeling the pull of that novelty, the same pull, honestly, that any new fashion or technology has exerted on human beings across every era of history since. There is something quietly moving and quietly recognizable in the idea that even in this ancient, half-legendary setting, human beings responded to new knowledge and new possibility with the same mixture of curiosity, desire, and unease that we still feel today. Whenever something genuinely new arrives and reshapes the shape of ordinary life faster than anyone quite knows how to process. The Book of Enoch treats all of this, the weapons, the cosmetics, the herbal knowledge, the reading of stars and clouds, as a single, unified catastrophe, a wholesale corruption of human life brought about by knowledge that arrived too suddenly, from an illegitimate source, without the slow moral and social development that might have allowed human communities to absorb it responsibly. And it's worth noting, before we move on, that this is a theme with a surprisingly long afterlife in Western storytelling more broadly. The idea that certain kinds of knowledge, however useful on the surface, might be fundamentally dangerous because of how they were obtained, echoes through countless later stories, from the Greek myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, to the biblical account of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, all the way through to modern anxieties about technologies developed faster than society's ability to manage their consequences responsibly. The Book of Enoch, sitting near the ancient root of this long tradition of stories, gives it one of its earliest and most vivid expressions, a whole catalog of specific, named knowledge, each piece traced back to a specific fallen angel, each one contributing to what the text describes as the earth being filled, gradually and then completely, with violence and corruption. And while all of this teaching was unfolding, the children born of the Watchers and their human wives were growing far faster and far larger than any human child had ever grown before. Let's turn to them now, because what the Book of Enoch describes happening to the world once the Nephilim reach their full size is, even by the standards of everything we've covered so far tonight, genuinely unsettling material, and it's worth sitting with slowly and carefully, the way the text itself seems to want us to. The Nephilim. The Book of Enoch tells us that the children born from the union of Watchers and human women grew to be 300 cubits tall, a measurement that, translated into modern terms, would put them at somewhere around 450 feet in height, a figure so extreme that most scholars who study the text treat it as intentional hyperbole rather than a claim meant to be taken with strict literal precision. In keeping with a broader ancient Near Eastern storytelling habit of using enormous, symbolic numbers to convey the scale of something monstrous or overwhelming, rather than to provide something like a measurement you could verify with a tape measure. Whatever the precise number intended, the underlying claim is clear and consistent across every version of the text that survives. These were beings of a size and strength that had no place in the ordinary human-scaled world, creatures that towered over the fields and villages we spent our first chapter imagining, casting shadows across landscapes that had never before needed to account for anything so large moving through them. And here is where the story turns from strange to genuinely disturbing, because the text tells us these giants required an amount of food that ordinary human agriculture simply could not sustain. Imagine for a moment the actual practical math of this. A single adult human in an ancient farming community required a certain amount of grain, a certain number of calories, carefully calculated across a hard-won harvest that an entire family had labored over for months, digging, planting, weeding, guarding against pests and drought, all to produce enough food to survive until the next harvest came around. Now imagine a being hundreds of times the size of an ordinary person, requiring, by any reasonable extrapolation, an amount of food no single village's fields could possibly provide, no matter how successful the harvest. According to the Book of Enoch, the Nephilim consumed everything they could get their hands on. First, the produce of human labor, the stored grain, the herds of livestock, the fruit of years of careful cultivation, devoured in what the text describes as an insatiable and escalating hunger. And when that wasn't enough, and it apparently never was, the text tells us they turned to eating human beings themselves. I want to be honest with you about how dark this particular section of the ancient text becomes, because I think it's worth understanding exactly why the story escalates the way it does, rather than softening it into something gentler than what the original authors actually wrote. The book describes the Nephilim devouring the labor and produce of human communities until there was nothing left to sustain them, and then turning on humanity directly, and it goes further still, describing them eventually turning on one another, consuming flesh and drinking blood in a spiral of violence that the text frames as a complete and total inversion of the natural order, predator and prey, creator and created, all thrown into a horrifying kind of chaos that had no precedent in the world as it had existed before the Watchers descended. Let's sit with what this might have meant for an ordinary family living through it, according to the logic of the story. Imagine a household we visited back in our first chapter, a farmer, his wife, their children, their small stock of goats, their carefully stored grain meant to see them through the winter months. Now imagine the terror of watching that entire, hard-won foundation of survival disappear, not gradually through drought or blight, familiar and terrible enemies that at least followed a recognizable pattern, but through the sudden, overwhelming presence of beings who simply took whatever they wanted, with no more regard for human suffering than a person might have for the suffering of insects displaced by a footstep. There's something worth noticing here about how ancient societies often processed real anxieties about famine, war, and social collapse through exactly this kind of exaggerated, monstrous imagery. We know from a wide range of archaeological and textual evidence across the ancient Near East that this general period and region experienced real and recurring crises, famines brought on by failed harvests, wars that displaced entire communities, and periods of what scholars sometimes describe as systems collapse, where the interconnected trade networks and political structures that had allowed complex societies to function broke down more or less simultaneously across a wide region. A phenomenon most dramatically documented around the 12th century before Christ, in what's often called the Late Bronze Age collapse, when a combination of factors, possibly including drought, invasion, internal rebellion, and the breakdown of trade routes, brought down multiple major civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean within the span of just a few decades. The people who told and eventually wrote down the story of the Nephilim were not strangers to genuine catastrophe. They and their ancestors had lived through real versions of exactly the kind of total societal breakdown that the story of ravenous, unstoppable giants captures in symbolic, mythic form. I think that's part of what gives this section of the Book of Enoch its lasting power, even for a modern audience encountering it for the first time. It isn't simply a monster story for its own sake. It's a story about what happens when the normal, fragile systems that allow human communities to survive, agriculture, cooperation, the basic moral boundaries between what is mine and what is yours, between predator and neighbor, break down completely and simultaneously, overwhelmed by a force too large and too hungry to be reasoned with or resisted through ordinary human means. The text tells us that as the Nephilim's violence and hunger grew, so did a kind of despair spreading across the human population, a sense that the world itself had become fundamentally unsafe in a way it had never been before. And it's here that the story introduces its second major thread of suffering, running alongside the direct physical danger posed by the giants themselves. According to the Book of Enoch, the spirits of the Nephilim, once these giant offspring eventually died, whether through the violence they inflicted on one another or through whatever other means brought their existence to an end, did not simply cease to exist the way an ordinary human soul might be expected to, according to the broader theological framework the text assumes. Instead, the text tells us these spirits became something new and different, a category of malevolent beings the text calls evil spirits, destined to roam the earth causing affliction and harm to human beings for as long as the world continued, oppressing, deceiving, and tormenting people in ways connected, in later interpretive tradition, to the very origins of what many ancient and even later religious communities understood as demonic activity in the world. This is a genuinely significant detail, and it's worth pausing on it, because it represents one of the ways the Book of Enoch's influence extended far beyond its own pages, shaping ideas that later became deeply embedded in broader Jewish and Christian thought about the nature of evil and spiritual affliction, even among communities and later religious traditions that never formally accepted the Book of Enoch itself as scripture. The idea that demonic forces active in the world trace their ultimate origin back to this specific, ancient catastrophe, the union of angels and humans and the violent, hungry offspring that union produced, gave later interpreters a coherent, connected explanation for something that otherwise might have remained frustratingly abstract: the question of where evil, understood as an active, personal, spiritual force, rather than simply an abstract quality of bad human choices, actually came from in the first place. I want you to imagine for a moment how this detail might have shaped the way an ancient audience understood their own everyday struggles and misfortunes. A sudden illness, a run of bad luck, a troubling dream, or a sense of oppression that seemed to come from somewhere outside oneself. In a worldview shaped by this story, these experiences weren't necessarily random, meaningless events, unconnected to any larger pattern. They were potentially the lingering echo of an ancient catastrophe, the restless remainder of beings who had once, according to the story, walked the earth as literal, physical giants, and who continued their disruption of human life in a new, invisible form, long after their physical bodies had been destroyed. It's a genuinely striking piece of ancient theological imagination, connecting the visible, physical horror of the giants directly to the invisible, ongoing struggles of everyday human life, in a way that must have given real, lived meaning to suffering that might otherwise have felt arbitrary and unexplained. Whether or not we share the theological framework that produced this idea, I think it's worth appreciating the coherence and the emotional logic of it, the way it takes several genuinely difficult and disparate human experiences, physical danger from external threats, the psychological weight of unexplained misfortune, and a general sense of the world having gone somehow wrong at a fundamental level, and weaves them into a single, continuous narrative, stretching from a specific mountain and a specific broken oath all the way down into the ordinary struggles of daily human life. But the world, according to this story, could not simply continue on this way indefinitely, with giants devouring the earth and evil spirits multiplying in their wake. Somewhere, someone had to notice, and according to the Book of Enoch, someone did. Let's go up now, away from the ravaged fields and the frightened villages, and turn our attention to what the text describes happening in heaven itself, as the suffering of the earth finally reached the ears of beings who still remained faithful to their proper place in the created order. The cry of the earth. The Book of Enoch describes this next part of the story with a phrase that I find genuinely beautiful, in a quiet, sorrowful way, even set against everything so dark that came before it. It tells us that the earth itself, laid waste and filled with violence, cried out, and that its cry reached all the way up to the gates of heaven. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because there's something in it that reaches well beyond the specific ancient context it was written in. The idea that suffering, when it becomes severe and widespread enough, produces a kind of cry that the created world itself sends upward, seeking a response from something beyond human capacity to fix, is an idea that echoes through an enormous amount of later religious and even purely literary tradition, right up to our own era. It captures something true about how communities actually experience catastrophe, the sense, when things have gone badly wrong enough on a large enough scale, that ordinary human effort no longer feels sufficient to address it, and something greater, some intervention from outside the normal, exhausted resources of a struggling community, feels like the only remaining hope. According to the text, 4 archangels, beings whose names would have carried real weight and familiarity for the ancient audience this book was written for, look down from heaven and witness the full scope of what has happened on earth. Michael, whose name means, roughly, who is like God, and who appears across a wide range of later Jewish and Christian tradition as a kind of chief military commander among the angels, a defender against evil. Gabriel, whose name suggests strength or might of God, and who becomes, in later tradition, particularly associated with delivering important messages, most famously in the Christian tradition that develops centuries later, the angel who announces to Mary that she will bear a son. Raphael, whose name means God heals, associated across later tradition with healing and restoration. And Uriel, whose name means God is my light, an angel closely associated, within the Book of Enoch itself, with guiding Enoch through visions of the cosmos, the movements of the stars, and the hidden structure of the world. These 4, according to the text, look down and see everything we've spent the last several chapters imagining together. They see the blood spilled across the earth, the devastation wrought by the Nephilim's hunger, and the accusations rising up from human beings themselves, crying out against the violence and lawlessness that has consumed their world. And they bring this testimony directly to God, described in the text in language of overwhelming, almost unapproachable majesty, seated upon a throne surrounded by categories of splendor the human language of the text strains to fully capture. What follows is, in effect, a kind of formal judicial proceeding, and I think this detail is worth pausing on, because it tells us something important about how the ancient authors of this text understood divine justice to actually function. It isn't depicted as arbitrary or sudden. It's depicted as careful, deliberate, almost bureaucratic in its precision, closer to a court hearing evidence and rendering a considered verdict than to an impulsive act of divine anger. Each archangel is given, in effect, a specific portfolio of responsibility for carrying out different aspects of the judgment that follows, and the text lays these responsibilities out with real, careful specificity. Raphael is instructed to bind Azazel, the angel most directly associated with teaching forbidden knowledge, and to cast him into darkness, into a specific desert location the text names, and to cover him with rough, sharp stones, and to leave him there until a final judgment, still to come at some future point beyond the immediate story, when he will finally be cast into fire. There's a detail in this instruction that I find quietly striking, connected to that earlier reference we discussed to the biblical ritual of the scapegoat sent out to Azazel in the wilderness. The text explicitly connects Azazel's punishment to the healing of the earth itself, instructing that once he is bound and removed, the earth, which he had corrupted through his teaching, might finally begin to be healed. Its wounds covered over the way, a physical injury might be bandaged and given the chance to mend. Gabriel is given a task that returns us directly to the giants themselves, instructed to go among the children of the Watchers, the Nephilim who had brought such devastation across the earth, and to set them against one another in a final, mutually destructive conflict, so that they might, in a kind of grim symmetry, bring about their own destruction through the very violence that had defined their brief, catastrophic existence. Michael is instructed to bind Shemiheza and the other Watchers who had descended with him, sealing them away, according to some versions of the text, for a period the text describes lasting 70 generations, until a final day of judgment still to come. I want you to imagine, for a moment, what it might have meant to an ancient audience to hear this level of specific, careful detail applied to divine punishment, especially set against the vague, terrifying chaos of everything that preceded it. There is something genuinely comforting, I think, buried inside even this dark material, in the idea that the beings responsible for causing such widespread suffering would face consequences precisely matched to their specific crimes, rather than simply vanishing into an unaccountable, unresolved void. Azazel, who corrupted the earth through forbidden knowledge, is bound within the earth itself, covered in stone, and connected explicitly to the earth's eventual healing. The Nephilim, who brought violence and devouring hunger into the world, are destroyed through exactly that same violence, turned finally against themselves. There's a kind of narrative and moral coherence here, a sense that the punishment fits, precisely and deliberately, the shape of the original transgression. But judgment against the Watchers and their monstrous offspring, however carefully rendered, doesn't fully address the underlying problem that had been building across the whole story. Human beings themselves, according to the broader biblical tradition this text sits alongside, had also become deeply and pervasively corrupted, their hearts, in the language of Genesis, inclined only toward evil continually. The violence unleashed by the Nephilim had been horrifying, but it had also, apparently, taught human beings something about violence that they could not simply unlearn once the giants themselves were gone. The knowledge Azazel and the other Watchers had taught, the metalworking, the weapon-making, could not be uninvented, even once its original teacher was bound away in darkness. And so the story turns, as we always knew it eventually would, toward water. Toward a decision, described in both Genesis and, with somewhat different emphasis and detail, in the Book of Enoch, to cleanse the earth entirely, to wash away not merely the giants and their spirits, but the whole corrupted generation of humanity that had grown up alongside them, sparing only a single family judged righteous enough to carry human life forward into whatever came next. That family, of course, centers on a man named Noah. And it's here, I think, that the story becomes something we can hold onto a little more familiarly, because whatever your own religious background or lack of one, The broad shape of Noah's story is likely one you've known since childhood: an ark, a flood, animals gathered two by two. But I want to spend real time in the chapter ahead on the parts of this story that most retellings leave out entirely: the actual, physical, daily reality of what building an ark and surviving inside one might genuinely have involved for one particular family living through the end of everything they had ever known. Let's go inside Noah's world now and imagine it slowly, the way it deserves. Noah and the Ark. I want you to imagine Noah first not as the figure we usually picture: an old man surrounded by pairs of animals boarding a wooden ship, but simply as a man living an ordinary life in a world that had, by this point in the story, become extraordinarily difficult to live an ordinary life within. The book of Genesis tells us Noah was already 600 years old when the flood came, a detail that sits alongside the similarly enormous lifespans given to the other early figures in this genealogy, Methuselah famously reaching 969 years, the longest recorded lifespan in the entire Hebrew Bible. Scholars have offered a range of explanations for these extraordinary numbers over the years, some pointing to possible differences in how ancient calendar systems calculated a year, others suggesting the numbers carry symbolic rather than strictly literal weight, connected to broader patterns of numerology common across ancient Near Eastern literature, where certain numbers carried significance beyond their simple mathematical value. Whatever the case, the text is clear that by the time we reach Noah, he is a man who has lived a genuinely long life, embedded deeply within a world that had, according to the story, grown progressively more corrupted around him across the generations he had personally witnessed. Let's imagine his household for a moment. The text tells us Noah had a wife, whose name isn't given in the biblical account itself, though later Jewish tradition offers several possibilities, among them a name recorded in some traditions as Nama, and 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, each of whom, the text tells us, already had wives of their own by the time the flood arrives. This is, in other words, a multi-generational household, not unlike the extended family compounds we imagined back in our very first chapter, several married couples living and working together under a shared roof, or a shared cluster of roofs, pooling labor and resources the way extended families across the ancient world typically did, because a single nuclear family, on its own, without extended kin nearby to share the burden of agricultural labor and childcare, would have struggled considerably to survive. I want you to imagine an ordinary morning in this household before anything about an ark has entered the picture at all. Noah waking before dawn, the way most people in this world would have, roused by the first gray light finding its way through whatever small opening served as a window, or simply by the internal rhythm of a body accustomed to rising with the sun because there was, quite literally, nothing productive to do in full darkness beyond conserving the household's limited store of oil or fat for lamplight. His sons already stirring in adjoining sleeping areas, their wives beginning the morning's work, tending whatever fire had been banked overnight to keep a few coals alive rather than needing to start entirely from scratch each day. A genuine skill in itself, requiring careful attention before sleep to bank the coals properly under ash, so they would smolder through the night rather than either burning out completely or, worse, spreading beyond the fire pit while everyone slept. Noah himself would likely have spent a good portion of each ordinary day exactly the way the other farmers in our story have, working fields, tending whatever livestock the family kept, engaged in the same slow, physically demanding, repetitive labor that defined nearly every day of nearly every ancient life we've imagined tonight. The text of Genesis tells us he was, in the language of the King James translation, a just man and perfect in his generations, and that he walked with God, an echo, deliberate or not, of the exact language used to describe his ancestor Enoch several generations earlier. But being righteous, in this ancient context, did not mean being exempt from ordinary labor or from the ordinary texture of daily life. It meant, more specifically, maintaining a kind of moral and religious integrity that the text tells us had become vanishingly rare in the world around him, a world it describes, starkly, as filled with violence and corruption on every side. I want you to imagine what it might have actually felt like to be a person of genuine moral seriousness, living inside a society the text describes as having become almost entirely given over to violence. In the specific, concrete world we've been building across this whole story, a world touched by the aftermath of the Watcher's teaching, still living with the psychological weight of whatever memory or legend had survived concerning the Nephilim's devastation. Generations removed perhaps from the giants themselves, but still shaped by the world they had left behind. Imagine the loneliness of that position, watching neighbors and quite possibly extended family members engage in behavior your own conscience simply could not accept, without any clear community of like-minded people to share that burden with, generation after generation. Watching the world around you seem to drift further and further from whatever standard you had inherited from your own father and grandfather. According to both Genesis and the fuller account preserved in the Book of Enoch, it's into this specific situation, a righteous man isolated within a deeply corrupted world, that a divine warning finally arrives. God speaks to Noah directly, according to the text, and tells him what is coming, a flood that will cover the entire earth, destroying every living creature that breathes air, and instructs him to build a vessel large enough to preserve his own family, along with a breeding population of every kind of animal, through the catastrophe that is about to unfold. Let's sit with the practical scale of what Noah is actually asked to do here, because I think modern retellings of this story, particularly the versions many of us encountered as small children, tend to flatten this into something almost gentle and manageable. A simple wooden boat with a friendly cartoon giraffe poking its head out the top. The measurements given in the text, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, translate, using the most common ancient cubit measurement of roughly 18 inches, into a vessel somewhere around 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall, dimensions genuinely comparable to a large modern cargo ship, constructed entirely from wood, using tools that, in this pre-metalworking or early metalworking world, would have consisted primarily of stone and possibly early bronze implements, without a single piece of modern machinery, without cranes, without power tools, without any of the infrastructure a modern shipbuilding project would take completely for granted. I want you to imagine the sheer, sustained physical labor this project would have actually required, stretched across what several ancient and later Jewish traditions suggest was a period of roughly 120 years of preparation, based on a specific verse in Genesis mentioning that number in connection with the time remaining before the flood. Trees would need to be selected, felled, likely using stone axes or, if the household had access to it, early bronze tools, a slow and exhausting process for even a single substantial tree, let alone the enormous quantity of timber a vessel of this size would require. Each felled tree would need to be stripped of branches, and the trunk itself worked down into usable planks and beams, a process that, before the invention of the mechanical saw, typically involved either splitting logs along the grain using wedges and mallets, or laboriously working them down with hand tools, adze and axe, shaping each piece individually, day after day, month after month, year after year. Imagine the sound of this project, echoing across whatever landscape Noah's family called home, the steady rhythm of axe against wood, the creak and groan of falling timber, the ongoing labor of moving felled logs, likely using teams of oxen or simply raw human muscle applied to ropes and rollers, from wherever they were felled to whatever site had been chosen for construction. Imagine the neighbors in this scenario, watching this enormous, seemingly inexplicable project unfold over years and then decades, a structure of a scale and shape unlike anything in their ordinary experience, rising slowly on dry land, nowhere near any body of water large enough to plausibly float a vessel of that size, in a world where boats, to whatever extent they existed at all in this early period, would have been small river craft or coastal vessels. Nothing remotely close to the scale of what Noah was constructing. The Book of 2 Peter, written many centuries later within the Christian tradition, refers to Noah as a preacher of righteousness, suggesting a tradition, developed well beyond the text of Genesis itself, that Noah spent this long period of construction not simply building in isolation, but actively warning the people around him about what was coming, urging them toward the same moral correction he himself had committed to, even as, according to the broader logic of the story, virtually none of them heeded that warning. I want you to imagine the particular loneliness embedded in that detail. A man spending over a century of his already extraordinarily long life engaged in warning and construction simultaneously, watching, presumably, generation after generation of neighbors dismiss or mock what he was doing, continuing the project regardless, because his conviction about what was coming never wavered, even as the visible evidence for it, an enormous, dry-docked vessel under a clear sky, must have seemed, to everyone around him, like the clearest possible evidence that he had lost his mind entirely. Let's think, too, about the practical challenge of gathering the animals themselves once construction was finally complete. Genesis describes pairs of every kind of animal, with 7 pairs specified for certain categories considered ritually clean, coming to Noah, rather than Noah needing to actively hunt and capture them himself, a detail the text frames as divinely arranged rather than as a purely human logistical achievement, which is worth noting, because the sheer practical difficulty of a single family capturing and safely transporting breeding pairs of every land-dwelling species across an ancient landscape, without modern trapping or transport technology, would have been, on purely human terms, almost impossible to imagine accomplishing. But once gathered, imagine the reality of the vessel's interior in the final days before the rains actually began. 3 levels, according to the text's description, a lower level, a middle level, and an upper level, connected by some kind of internal structure allowing movement between them, and a single door, through which everyone and everything would need to enter before it was sealed. Imagine the sound alone, inside a wooden structure of that scale, housing what the text implies was a truly enormous variety of animal life, the calls and cries of creatures never previously housed together in such close proximity, the smell of so many different animals confined in adjoining spaces, the practical, unglamorous, exhausting daily labor that feeding and caring for all of them across the duration of the flood itself would have required, work that would have fallen. In this small family of 8 people total, Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their 3 sons' wives on every single member of the household, likely around the clock in shifts, for the entire duration of their time enclosed within the vessel. The text tells us the rains, once they finally began, continued for 40 days and 40 nights, though the fuller chronology given in Genesis suggests the family remained inside the ark considerably longer than that, over a year in total, by the time the waters had fully receded and the ground had dried sufficiently for them to finally emerge. I want you to imagine what over a year, confined largely within a wooden structure, surrounded by the sounds and smells of that many animals, cut off entirely from the outside world, with no ability to step outside for fresh air or open ground beneath your feet, might have actually felt like, psychologically as well as physically, for 8 human beings who had, in a single sudden transition, gone from an ordinary agricultural existence to becoming, quite literally, the entire surviving population of humanity, carrying the full weight of whatever came next entirely on their own shoulders. It's worth pausing, too, on a detail that connects this whole story back to where we began tonight. According to the Book of Enoch, and to a broader strand of ancient Jewish tradition surrounding this period, Noah's own birth had been marked by strange and troubling signs, and there was apparently some concern, within his own family, about whether he himself might somehow be connected to the corrupted lineage of the Watchers, a concern serious enough that his father Lamech, according to the fuller account preserved in fragments connected to the Enochic tradition, sought reassurance from his own father Methuselah, who in turn consulted Enoch himself, who confirmed that Noah was fully human, entirely untouched by the corruption spreading across the rest of the world, and destined specifically to survive what was coming and to become, in the text's own language, a plant of righteousness, from whom a new and better humanity might eventually grow. I find something quietly moving in that detail, honestly, sitting with it now at the end of this long chapter. In a story otherwise so dominated by giants and corrupted knowledge and violence beyond ordinary human scale, the actual hope the narrative eventually rests on is something far smaller and more intimate. A single family, gathered together inside a wooden vessel, caring for frightened animals in the dark, uncertain of exactly how long their confinement would last, holding onto nothing more than a promise made generations earlier, that this particular family line had remained untouched by everything that had gone wrong around them, and might therefore be trusted to carry something worth preserving forward into whatever world waited for them once the waters finally receded. Let's follow them now, through the flood itself, and into whatever came after. A year inside the ark. Let's slow down even further now, before we follow the family out into the flood itself, and spend some real time with what the actual daily texture of life inside that vessel might genuinely have felt like. Because I think this is exactly the kind of ordinary, unglamorous detail that most retellings of this story skip past entirely, rushing from the closing of the door straight to the moment the waters finally begin to recede. Imagine the very first night, once the great door had been sealed, the family and every animal they had gathered finally enclosed together inside a wooden structure the size of a modern cargo ship, with no way of knowing, at that early point, exactly how long this confinement would actually last. I want you to imagine the sound of it, because sound, more than almost anything else, would have defined this experience for the people living through it. The low, constant creaking of an enormous wooden hull, settling and shifting even before the rains had properly begun. The kind of structural groaning that any large wooden vessel produces as its many joined timbers respond to changes in temperature, humidity, and eventually the movement of water beneath it. Layered over that, an entire menagerie of animal sound, unfamiliar to any of them in this particular combination and proximity. The lowing of cattle, the bleating of goats and sheep, bird song and bird call from species that would ordinarily never have shared airspace at all. And somewhere beneath all of it, the rustle and scratch of smaller creatures in their own separate enclosures. Mice and insects, and whatever else the text's broad category of every kind of animal was ultimately understood to include. Think about the practical question of feeding all of this life, because it's a question the text itself doesn't dwell on at length, but one that would have consumed an enormous portion of this family's daily existence throughout the entire duration of their confinement. Jewish tradition developed outside the biblical text itself, reflected in later rabbinic commentary written centuries after the flood story had already become firmly established, wrestles seriously with exactly this problem, describing Noah and his family as barely sleeping across the entire voyage, moving constantly between different levels and different enclosures, matching each animal's particular dietary needs, some requiring fresh fodder at set times, others requiring meat, others requiring foods gathered and stored specifically for their unique requirements, a logistical challenge that later tradition imagines as having required careful planning stretching back across the entire century of preparation, storing not just enough food to last the voyage, but the right kinds of food in the right proportions, for a truly enormous range of different creatures, each with entirely different needs. Imagine, too, the practical, unglamorous reality of waste in a sealed wooden structure housing this much animal life for well over a year. Later Jewish tradition addresses this too, with some accounts suggesting the ark included some kind of internal system for regularly clearing waste down through the vessel's different levels, work that would have been constant, physically demanding, and almost certainly among the least pleasant tasks any member of this family faced each day. I mention this not to dwell on anything unpleasant for its own sake, but because I think it matters for really understanding this story, to sit honestly with just how much purely physical, exhausting labor this entire scenario would have actually required, day after day, for well over a year, from just 8 people, with no outside help of any kind, no ability to step away or take a break, no possibility of trading this responsibility with anyone beyond the 7 other members of their own immediate household. Let's imagine, too, the quieter, more psychological texture of this confinement. I want you to picture the family gathered together at the end of an exhausting day of feeding and tending, in whatever space they had set aside as their own living quarters within the vessel, likely lit by whatever oil lamps they had thought to bring, the flickering light casting long shadows against timber walls, the sound of rain still falling steadily somewhere above them, an unbroken, monotonous rhythm that must have become, across weeks and eventually months, both strangely comforting in its predictability and quietly maddening in its refusal to stop. Imagine conversations returning, again and again, to the same unanswerable questions. How much longer? What might be left once the water finally receded? Whether the world outside still existed at all, in any recognizable form, or whether they had, in fact, become the entire surviving population of a planet otherwise completely emptied of human life. There would have been arguments, almost certainly. The way any group of people confined together under sustained stress inevitably experiences friction, however loving or however committed to a shared, larger purpose they might be. There would have been long stretches of genuine boredom, an emotion this story rarely gets credit for containing, but one that seems almost unavoidable, given the actual timeline involved. Month after month of repetitive labor, feeding, cleaning, checking on the animals, waiting, with no external stimulation beyond the sound of rain and the increasingly familiar sounds of the animals housed around them, and no ability to see outside at all beyond whatever limited opening the vessel's design provided. I find something worth sitting with in this quieter, more mundane version of the Ark story, because I think it makes the family's eventual emergence, and that small green olive leaf we spent time with earlier tonight, land with even more genuine emotional weight than the more dramatic, condensed version most of us grew up with. This wasn't a brief, exciting adventure. It was over a year of sustained, exhausting, repetitive labor, performed by ordinary people doing the unglamorous work required to keep a truly enormous number of living creatures alive, day after day, without any guarantee, until that leaf actually appeared in the dove's beak, that any of it would ultimately prove to have been worth the effort. The flood, the silence after, and a book nearly lost to time. Genesis describes the flood itself in language that still carries real force, even across the enormous distance of centuries separating us from whoever first wrote these words down. The fountains of the great deep are described as breaking open, and the windows of heaven as being opened, an image that reflects the broader ancient Near Eastern understanding of the cosmos we touched on earlier. A world where the sky itself was imagined as a kind of solid dome, holding back a vast reservoir of water above it, with the ordinary rain we experience passing through smaller openings in that dome, and a flood of this catastrophic scale requiring the full opening of the dome's greater windows. Alongside water rising up from beneath the earth itself, from springs and underground reservoirs breaking their ordinary bounds entirely. Imagine, for a moment, the actual sound of this beginning from inside the Ark. Rain, certainly, but rain unlike anything the family had ever experienced, not the ordinary seasonal rainfall that farming communities across this region depended on and understood the rhythm of, but something continuous, overwhelming, hour after hour without pause, day after day without any sign of the usual patterns breaking through. And beneath that sound, something else, a deeper, more unsettling noise that the text's imagery suggests, water rising not only from above but from below, the ground itself becoming saturated and then submerged, familiar landmarks disappearing one by one beneath a surface that simply kept climbing. Genesis tells us the waters eventually rose 15 cubits above the highest mountains, roughly 22 feet, submerging even what the ancient world understood as the tallest points on Earth entirely beneath the flood. I want you to imagine what this would have meant, practically, for the small family and their collection of animals, floating somewhere above a world that had, in the space of what the text describes as a relatively short period, become entirely unrecognizable, no shoreline visible in any direction, no mountain peak breaking the surface, nothing at all but water extending to every horizon, day after day, with no way of knowing from inside the Ark how far this devastation actually extended. or whether anything at all remained beneath them besides open ocean. There's a particular kind of isolation in that image that I think deserves real attention, distinct from ordinary loneliness or ordinary fear. This is a family who had, in the space of little more than a month, gone from being part of a wider human community. However corrupted the text tells us that community had become, to being genuinely and completely alone, the only human beings left alive anywhere on the entire visible world, with absolutely no way of confirming that state of affairs beyond their own direct, immediate experience inside a sealed wooden vessel. Imagine the particular quality of grief this must have carried alongside the fear, even for people who understood, according to the story's own theological framework, that this destruction served a necessary and ultimately restorative purpose. Neighbors, however flawed, extended family members beyond the immediate household, an entire world of human relationships, memories, and shared history, gone, all at once, leaving behind 8 people and whatever animals they had managed to preserve. Genesis tells us that after the rain finally stopped, the water took a considerable time to recede, the ark eventually coming to rest, according to the text, upon the mountains of Ararat, a mountainous region in what is now eastern Turkey, and that Noah, after some additional waiting, released first a raven and later a dove to test whether dry land had actually reappeared anywhere within reach. The detail of the dove is one of the most quietly beautiful images in the entire flood narrative, and it's worth sitting with slowly. The dove returns the first time with nothing, the world still entirely submerged. Noah waits 7 more days and sends it out again, and this time it returns carrying a freshly plucked olive leaf, a small, specific, physical piece of evidence that somewhere beneath the retreating water, life had already begun to reassert itself, trees putting out new growth even before the ground itself had fully dried. I want you to imagine holding that leaf if you were Noah, after a year of confinement, after losing an entire world, after the sustained uncertainty of not knowing whether anything at all remained beyond the walls of your vessel. A single leaf, still green, still soft, evidence not of survival in some abstract sense, but of the specific, ordinary biological fact that a tree somewhere had continued its quiet work of growing, indifferent to the catastrophe that had reshaped everything around it. There's something in that image that speaks to a very old and very human hope, the sense that even after total devastation, the basic, patient processes of life, growth, renewal, the simple persistence of a tree putting out new leaves, continue on regardless, waiting to be discovered again by whoever survives long enough to go looking for them. When the family and the animals finally emerged, Genesis tells us Noah's first act was to build an altar and offer a sacrifice, and that this act was met with a divine promise, sealed by the appearance of a rainbow, that a flood of this scale would never again be sent to destroy the earth. It's a genuinely striking narrative choice, worth sitting with for a moment. The story doesn't end with triumph or celebration in any straightforward sense. It ends with an act of worship, and with a promise specifically oriented around restraint, a commitment from this point forward not to erase creation entirely, regardless of whatever failures might follow. Human beings, the text seems to suggest, would continue to make the same fundamental mistakes their ancestors had made. But the world itself, going forward, would be allowed to absorb and survive those mistakes, rather than facing complete erasure each time human corruption reached some unbearable threshold. Now, I want to shift our attention gently away from the story itself, and back toward the true history we began this evening with, because there's a final piece of that history worth sitting with before we let this long night's journey come to its close. For all the vivid, careful detail the Book of Enoch provides about the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the judgment that followed, it never became part of the official canon of either Judaism or, with the notable exception we've already discussed, most of Christianity. This wasn't a simple accident, or a matter of the text having simply been forgotten through neglect. Ancient religious communities, across the centuries following the Book of Enoch's composition, made active, deliberate decisions about which texts would be treated as authoritative scripture, and which would not, decisions shaped by a complicated mixture of theological concern, historical circumstance, and in some cases, simple debate about a given text's actual age and authorship. Some early church writers in the first few centuries after Christ clearly knew and respected the Book of Enoch. The clearest evidence for this sits directly within the New Testament itself, in the small book of Jude, which explicitly quotes Enoch by name, attributing to him a prophecy about divine judgment coming upon the ungodly, language drawn quite directly from material found in the surviving Book of Enoch. Early Christian writers such as Tertullian, writing in North Africa around the turn of the 3rd century, defended the book's authenticity and value, while others, including the influential later theologian Augustine, expressed real skepticism about whether a text claiming to have been written by a man who lived before the flood could plausibly have survived, in any reliable form, across the vast span of time and the total catastrophe of the flood itself. A genuinely reasonable practical objection. When you sit with it, given everything the flood narrative itself tells us about the complete destruction of the pre-flood world. By the 4th and 5th centuries, as the broader canon of Christian scripture became increasingly formalized through a series of church councils and widening theological consensus, the Book of Enoch was gradually excluded from what would become the standard biblical canon across most of the Christian world, surviving, as we discussed earlier, primarily within the specific tradition of the Ethiopian church. Largely because that church's relative geographic and political isolation from the councils and debates shaping canon decisions elsewhere allowed its own earlier tradition regarding the text's value to simply continue undisturbed. Within Judaism, similarly, the book found no lasting place within the Hebrew Bible as it was eventually finalized, likely for reasons connected both to genuine questions about its authorship and date, and to theological discomfort in certain influential circles, with some of its more elaborate claims about angelic beings, cosmic geography, and speculative detail well beyond what more restrained texts within the eventual canon were willing to commit to. I think it's worth resisting here any simple story about this exclusion representing some kind of deliberate cover-up or suppression of dangerous, forbidden truth, a framing that has become genuinely popular in certain corners of modern discussion about the Book of Enoch, but one that doesn't hold up especially well against the actual historical evidence we have. What we see, instead, looking honestly at the historical record, is something closer to the ordinary, complicated process by which any religious or literary tradition eventually settles on which texts it will treat as central and authoritative, a process shaped by genuine debate, genuine disagreement, and decisions that, viewed from within different communities, could reasonably land in different places, as they in fact did with one entire ancient, continuously practicing Christian tradition, reaching a different conclusion than the rest, and simply continuing to treat the book as scripture regardless of what decisions were being made elsewhere. What's genuinely remarkable, I think, sitting with all of this now, is simply that the text survived at all in any form given how close it came, on more than one occasion across its long history, to being lost entirely, dependent at every stage on specific, identifiable human decisions, made by specific people we can actually name and locate in history, to keep copying it, to keep preserving it, to keep traveling with actual physical manuscripts across genuinely dangerous distances, until, quite late in its story, modern scholarship finally caught up with what one small, persistent, geographically isolated Christian community had known and preserved all along. And it's worth remembering, too, as we come to the end of this long story tonight, that the flood narrative itself, in its broadest strokes, a great catastrophe sent to correct a world grown irredeemably corrupt, a small group of survivors preserved through some form of vessel, a subsequent renewal of the earth, appears, as we touched on earlier, across an enormous range of ancient cultures, from Mesopotamia to Greece to, in modified forms, flood traditions recorded among indigenous cultures across the world, from parts of the Americas to Australia to East Asia, each one shaped by its own specific geography and theology, but each one wrestling, in its own way, with the same enormous, difficult human question. What do you do with a world that seems to have gone fundamentally wrong? And where does the hope for beginning again actually come from, when everything familiar has been swept away? The Book of Enoch, and the fuller story it helps us understand sitting alongside the more familiar account in Genesis, offers one particular, richly detailed answer to that question. An answer involving broken oaths on a real mountain, forbidden knowledge smuggled across a boundary that was never meant to be crossed, giants whose hunger outgrew the world's capacity to sustain them, and finally, a careful, patient, specifically targeted judgment, followed by the quiet, deliberate preservation of a single family judged worth carrying forward into whatever came next. Two ways of reading the same old verse. Before we let this story rest for the night, I want to slow down and spend some time with a genuine scholarly puzzle sitting right at the heart of everything we've discussed tonight, because I think it deserves honest attention, rather than being smoothed over as though there's only ever been one accepted way to understand it. The entire foundation of the Watcher's story, both in the Book of Enoch and in its brief, compressed appearance in the 6th chapter of Genesis, rests on a single, somewhat ambiguous phrase. Genesis tells us that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and that they took them as wives, and it's from this handful of words that the entire, elaborate narrative of angelic descent, forbidden knowledge, and giant offspring eventually grows. But who, exactly, does the phrase sons of God actually refer to? And this is a question that ancient interpreters themselves did not agree on, and that modern biblical scholars continue to debate today, with real, serious arguments existing on more than one side. The interpretation we've been following throughout tonight's story, sometimes called the angelic interpretation, understands the sons of God as literal heavenly beings, angels who descended and took on some form capable of physical union with human women. This reading has real textual support beyond just Genesis and Enoch. The exact same Hebrew phrase, sons of God, appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, most notably in the opening chapters of the Book of Job, where it fairly clearly refers to members of a heavenly divine council gathering before God, beings distinct from humanity, present in a scene where a figure called the Satan, meaning something closer to the accuser or adversary in its original context, rather than the fully developed figure of later Christian theology, appears among them. This same interpretation appears to have been the dominant reading within Second Temple Judaism, the broad period of Jewish religious life and literature stretching from roughly the 6th century before Christ to the 1st century after, the period during which the Book of Enoch itself was composed, and during which a considerable amount of other Jewish literature we still have access to today, reflects a similar, comfortable acceptance of this angelic reading as the natural, straightforward sense of the Genesis text. We also have historical evidence that this angelic interpretation was well known and taken seriously well into the early Christian period. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing near the end of the 1st century after Christ, references a tradition of angels mingling with human women and producing giant offspring in his history of the Jewish people, treating it as an established piece of received tradition rather than something novel or unusual. Several early Christian writers held this view as well, and as we discussed in our previous chapter, the small New Testament book of Jude directly quotes the Book of Enoch and seems to assume its readers will recognize and accept the angelic framework without needing extensive explanation. A related, and admittedly more difficult, passage in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which mentions women covering their heads because of the angels, has also occasionally been connected by scholars to this same broader tradition, though this particular connection remains considerably more debated and uncertain than the clearer references in Jude. But this was never the only interpretation available, even in antiquity, and over time, a different reading gradually became dominant within both Jewish and, eventually, most of Christian tradition, particularly from roughly the 4th century onward. This alternative view, often called the Sethite interpretation, understands the sons of God not as literal angelic beings, but as the righteous descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve mentioned back in Genesis chapter 4, following the murder of Abel by Cain. In this reading, the daughters of men refer specifically to the descendants of Cain's line, understood within this interpretation as having become progressively more wicked and worldly, and the sin being described in Genesis 6 is not a literal angelic incursion into the human world at all, but rather the gradual intermarriage and moral compromise of a previously separate, righteous lineage with a corrupted one. A reading that removes the more overtly supernatural element entirely and reframes the whole passage as being about human moral failure alone. Why did this shift happen? Scholars who have studied the history of this interpretive debate point to a few converging factors. Some early and influential Christian theologians, working in a broader intellectual environment increasingly shaped by Greek philosophical assumptions about the fixed, unchanging nature of spiritual beings, found the idea of angels engaging in physical reproduction with humans theologically and philosophically uncomfortable, a category confusion that seemed to violate what they understood as the proper, settled nature of angelic existence. There was also, as we discussed in the previous chapter, a growing wariness within the developing mainstream church toward the Book of Enoch itself and the elaborate speculative tradition surrounding it, and rejecting the angelic interpretation of Genesis 6 was one way of distancing official church teaching from a text and a tradition that had become associated, in some circles, with material considered increasingly unreliable or even suspect. I think it's worth being honest in a conversation like this one, that neither interpretation can be proven with absolute certainty from the available ancient evidence alone, and that serious, careful scholars, both religious and secular, continue to hold different positions on this question even now. What we can say with real confidence is that the angelic interpretation appears to be both the older reading and the one most naturally suggested by the plain language of the original Hebrew text. When that text is read on its own terms, alongside its closest biblical parallel in the Book of Job, without the accumulated weight of several additional centuries of subsequent theological reflection layered on top of it. It's also the interpretation that clearly underlies the entire tradition we've spent tonight exploring in the Book of Enoch, and the one that the author of the New Testament Book of Jude appears to have simply taken for granted as correct. But the Sethite interpretation, developed by later, genuinely careful and thoughtful readers grappling with real theological difficulties in the more supernatural reading, has its own long, serious history and its own real defenders, and it would be dishonest to present it as a simple, dismissible alternative rather than as a genuine, historically significant strand of interpretation in its own right, one that shaped how an enormous number of readers across many centuries, Jewish and Christian alike, actually understood this passage. I find something worth sitting with in the fact that a single, brief, somewhat ambiguous phrase, 4 words in the original Hebrew, could generate this much sustained interpretive effort and disagreement across more than 2,000 years of continuous reading and rereading. It's a reminder, I think, of just how much interpretive work goes into transforming any ancient text, however sacred or authoritative a given community considers it, into a coherent, meaningful story work that involves real choices, real uncertainty, and real disagreement among careful, sincere readers, rather than simply reading a single, self-evident meaning directly off the page without any interpretive labor at all. It's also worth noting, before we move on, that this interpretive uncertainty doesn't actually undermine the deeper questions the story as a whole seems most interested in asking. Questions about the origin and nature of evil, about the corrupting potential of knowledge or power obtained illegitimately, about the relationship between human moral failure and the wider suffering of the created world, and about what, if anything, might justify hope for a genuine new beginning after catastrophe. Whether you understand the sons of God as literal fallen angels descending from Mount Hermon, or as human beings from a once separate, righteous lineage gradually compromising their own moral inheritance through intermarriage with a corrupted line, the underlying human concerns the story is grappling with remain essentially the same, and remain, honestly, just as relevant to sit with quietly tonight as they would have been to the ancient audiences who first heard this story told and retold, long before anyone thought to write any of it down at all. Now, let's widen our view just a little further still, because the flood, and the broader pattern of a world grown corrupt and then judged and renewed, doesn't belong only to this one specific tradition. Let's spend a little time with how other ancient cultures, working entirely independently, or in some cases in close cultural contact with the same broader world that produced Genesis and Enoch, told strikingly similar stories of their own. Echoes across the ancient world. Let's travel for a moment away from ancient Israel and toward Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, home to some of the oldest cities and the oldest surviving written literature anywhere on Earth, because it's here that we find some of the closest and most historically significant parallels to the flood story we've spent tonight exploring. The most famous of these parallels comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, an ancient Mesopotamian poem whose surviving form dates to roughly the second millennium before Christ, though it draws on older Sumerian material stretching back centuries earlier still. Within this epic, the hero Gilgamesh, seeking the secret of immortality, travels to meet a man named Utnapishtim, who tells him the story of a great flood sent by the god Enlil to destroy humanity. A flood Utnapishtim survives by building a large boat at the instruction of another god, who warns him secretly of what is coming. Utnapishtim, like Noah, brings his family and representatives of the animal world aboard his vessel, and in a detail that will sound immediately familiar, sends out birds, first a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven, to determine whether dry land has reappeared. The similarities here are close enough that scholars have studied this relationship intensively, since the Gilgamesh flood account was first translated and published in the 1870s, an event that caused genuine, considerable excitement and controversy at the time, because it was one of the first pieces of clear archaeological and textual evidence, suggesting that the biblical flood story existed within a much wider ancient Near Eastern literary tradition, rather than standing as a completely unique, isolated account. An even earlier Mesopotamian version, found in a text scholars call the Atrahasis epic, dating to around the 18th century before Christ, gives us a flood story with an even more developed theological explanation for why the gods decide to destroy humanity in the first place, describing human overpopulation and the resulting noise disturbing the god Enlil's rest as a key motivating factor. A wonderfully human, almost domestic complaint sitting at the root of a story about total, catastrophic destruction. I want to be careful and honest here about what these parallels do and do not tell us. They don't necessarily mean that the biblical authors simply copied the Mesopotamian material directly, though direct literary influence, particularly during and after the period of Babylonian exile in the 6th century before Christ, when a substantial portion of the Israelite population lived for decades under direct Mesopotamian political and cultural influence, remains a genuine and actively debated possibility among biblical scholars. What these parallels more clearly suggest, at minimum, is that both traditions were drawing on a much older, shared cultural memory, common across the ancient Near East, of catastrophic flooding events severe enough, and remembered vividly enough across many generations, to shape religious storytelling in multiple, related but independently developing cultures across this region. Some scholars and geologists have pointed to specific candidate events that might lie behind this shared memory, including major flooding associated with the lower reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates river system, an area genuinely prone to catastrophic seasonal flooding throughout its documented history, and even more speculatively, a proposed dramatic flooding event connected to the Black Sea around 7,000 years ago. Though this particular theory remains genuinely contested among specialists and should be treated as one interesting hypothesis among several, rather than as settled historical fact. What's specifically relevant to our story tonight, though, is that Mesopotamian mythology also contains its own tradition of divine or semi-divine beings interacting closely with early humanity, in ways that bear some genuinely interesting resemblance to the Watcher's tradition, even though the details differ considerably. Mesopotamian literature describes a category of beings called the Apkallu, 7 wise sages sent by the god before the flood to teach humanity the foundations of civilization, writing, agriculture, law, craftsmanship, and religious ritual. Unlike the Watchers of Enoch, the Apkallu are generally portrayed positively in the surviving Mesopotamian texts, benevolent culture bringers rather than rebellious corruptors, though later, more ambiguous Mesopotamian tradition does associate at least one of the seven, sometimes named Adapa, with a more troubling story involving lost immortality and divine punishment. I find this comparison genuinely illuminating, not because it proves any direct historical connection between the specific Apkallu tradition and the specific Watchers tradition. A connection scholars remain appropriately cautious about asserting with confidence given the real differences between the two traditions, but because it shows us something valuable about a much broader ancient pattern of thought. Across multiple, distinct ancient Near Eastern cultures, we find recurring stories addressing a very similar underlying human question. Where did the foundational knowledge and technology of early civilization actually come from? And what was the moral cost, if any, of humanity acquiring it? The Mesopotamian answer, broadly speaking, tends toward gratitude, wise emissaries sent by benevolent gods to help humanity along. The tradition preserved in Enoch tends instead toward suspicion and warning, knowledge stolen and smuggled by rebellious beings who had abandoned their proper place, carrying real and lasting corruption along with whatever practical benefit it provided. Let's travel further west now to ancient Greece, where we find yet another version of this same broad pattern, expressed through entirely different characters and a very different cosmology, but wrestling, in its own way, with strikingly similar underlying concerns. The Greek myth of Prometheus, most fully preserved for us in the work of the playwright Aeschylus, writing in the 5th century before Christ, though drawing on considerably older material, describes a titan who steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity, an act of genuine, transformative benefit to human civilization, allowing warmth, cooked food, metalworking, and the broader development of human technology and culture. But one that is nonetheless treated by the ruling god Zeus as a serious transgression, punished with famous, sustained severity, Prometheus bound to a rock, his liver eaten daily by an eagle and regrown each night to be eaten again the following day, an eternal punishment for a single act of illegitimate transfer between the divine and human worlds. The structural resemblance here to the Enoch tradition is worth sitting with slowly. In both cases, we have divine or semi-divine figures transferring genuinely useful knowledge or technology to humanity. In both cases, this transfer happens outside of properly sanctioned channels, against the wishes of the presiding divine authority, and in both cases the being responsible for the transfer faces severe, specifically tailored punishment as a direct result, bound to a fixed location, and left to suffer across a vast span of time. Whether this resemblance reflects any actual historical contact or influence between early Greek and early Semitic religious traditions, both of which developed within the broader, interconnected world of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, where trade, migration, and cultural exchange between Greek-speaking and Semitic-speaking populations was genuinely extensive across many centuries, remains a question scholars continue to investigate and debate, rather than one with a single, settled answer available to us tonight. Greek mythology gives us one further parallel worth mentioning, closer still to the specific Nephilim tradition, in its stories of the Titans and the Giants, both categories of enormous, superhumanly powerful beings who exist in a state of ongoing conflict with the Olympian gods, eventually defeated, and in the case of the Titans specifically, imprisoned in the depths of the underworld region called Tartarus. A fate genuinely reminiscent of the binding and imprisonment described for the Watchers and their monstrous offspring in the Book of Enoch. Again, direct historical connection remains uncertain and actively debated among specialists in comparative ancient religion, but the recurring pattern across these otherwise quite distinct cultures: enormous, dangerous beings born from some illegitimate mixing of divine and earthly power, eventually defeated and bound away by a properly ordered divine authority, suggests something genuinely widespread in how ancient human communities across this broader region processed anxiety about power, violence, and disorder that seemed to exceed ordinary, comprehensible human scale. I want to close this particular thread of our conversation with one final, broader observation, because I think it matters for how we understand not just this specific story, but ancient religious storytelling more generally. These parallel traditions, Mesopotamian, Greek, Israelite, and the many other scholars of comparative religion have documented across cultures with far less direct contact with one another still. From flood traditions recorded among various indigenous communities across the Americas and the Pacific, to catastrophic destruction myths preserved in cultures with essentially no plausible historical contact with the ancient Near East at all, tell us something genuinely important about human beings as storytelling creatures, wherever and whenever they've lived. Across an enormous range of independently developing cultures, human communities have consistently reached for very similar narrative structures: catastrophe, judgment, a small remnant preserved, a new beginning to process some of the most difficult and universal aspects of human experience: our vulnerability to forces vastly larger than ourselves, our complicated, ambivalent relationship with our own hard-won knowledge and technology, and our persistent, remarkably durable hope that even total devastation might not be the final word, that something worth carrying forward might still survive, waiting quietly to be discovered, the way a single green leaf, carried carefully back by a small gray bird, once told an old man floating somewhere above a drowned world that dry land and a new beginning had not been lost after all. The monks who kept the watch. I want to take you somewhere very specific now, before we let this long story finally come to rest, because I think there's one more piece of true human history tonight that deserves the same slow, careful attention we've given to Noah's Ark and to the mountain where the Watchers made their oath. I want to take you into an Ethiopian highland monastery, sometime in the medieval centuries when the Book of Enoch's survival depended entirely on the patient, unglamorous labor of monks whose names, in almost every case, have not come down to us at all. Imagine the elevation first, because it matters. Much of the Ethiopian highlands sits well over 8,000 feet above sea level, a landscape of steep, green mountains and deep river gorges, cool enough, even close to the equator, that a chill sets into the air the moment the sun drops behind the ridgeline each evening. Many of Ethiopia's oldest and most important monasteries were built in genuinely remote, defensible locations, carved into cliff faces or perched on the flat summits of dramatic table mountains called ambas, accessible sometimes only by narrow paths or, in a few famous cases, by ropes and pulleys lowered down sheer rock faces. A deliberate choice reflecting both the contemplative desire for isolation from ordinary worldly distraction and the very practical need for defensibility, in a region that experienced its own long history of political upheaval and periodic conflict across the centuries. These manuscripts were being copied. Let's go inside the scriptorium, the room, or in some cases simply a quiet corner of a larger monastic building, where the actual work of copying manuscripts took place. Imagine cold stone or packed earth beneath bare or sandaled feet, walls thick enough to hold in whatever warmth a small fire or a handful of bodies working together might generate, and light, always light, as the single most precious and carefully managed resource in the entire room. Monasteries of this era and region worked primarily by whatever daylight came through small windows or open doorways, supplemented, when necessary, by the light of simple oil lamps, likely burning a locally available oil, their flames small, smoky, and precious, never to be wasted on anything but the most necessary work, because oil, like nearly everything else in this world, had to be produced, transported, or traded for, through real and considerable human effort. Imagine the scribe himself, a monk who might have spent years, even decades, of his religious life dedicated substantially to exactly this work, seated on a low stool or simply cross-legged on the floor, a wooden board or a specially constructed writing desk balanced across his knees. In front of him, an older manuscript, the exemplar he is copying from, its parchment pages made from carefully treated and stretched animal skin, most likely goat or sheep, showing the wear of however many previous readings and however many years of storage in a climate that, for all its relative coolness, still posed genuine ongoing threats from humidity, insects, and simple physical decay. His tools would have been simple and few. A reed pen, cut and trimmed by hand, requiring frequent ray sharpening as the tip wore down through use. Ink mixed locally, likely from a base of soot or charcoal combined with a binding agent such as gum, diluted carefully with water to the correct consistency. Too thin and it would smear or fade, too thick and it would clog the pen and sit unevenly on the page. And the parchment itself, each individual sheet the product of its own considerable labor, an animal skin that had to be soaked, scraped clean of hair and flesh, stretched taut on a wooden frame, and dried and smoothed over a period of days before it was ever ready to receive a single word. I want you to imagine the actual physical sensation of this work, sustained across hours, likely across many consecutive days for a text of any real length. The particular ache that develops in a hand and forearm held in the same careful, controlled position for extended periods, forming each letter of an unfamiliar and visually complex script, Ge'ez, an ancient Ethiopian Semitic language written in its own distinctive syllabic alphabet, quite different in appearance from the Hebrew, Greek, or Latin alphabets more familiar to most of us, requiring real, sustained visual concentration to reproduce accurately, letter by letter, syllable by syllable, line by line, with essentially no margin for the kind of easy correction a modern writer takes entirely for granted. A significant mistake, once ink had dried on the page, generally could not simply be erased. It had to be carefully scraped away with a blade, if caught in time, or if not, it would simply become a permanent part of that particular copy, potentially propagating forward into whatever future copies were eventually made from this one, an error quietly compounding across generations of transmission, the way small mutations accumulate across generations of biological inheritance. Think, too, about the sounds that would have surrounded this work. The scratch of reed pen against parchment, a small, dry, persistent sound, present for hours at a stretch. The low, steady rhythm of prayers or liturgical chanting drifting in from elsewhere in the monastery complex, because monastic life across this period, in Ethiopia as much as anywhere else in the medieval Christian world, was structured tightly around a daily cycle of prayer. The whole rhythm of the day organized around specific hours set aside for communal worship, meaning our scribe's work would have been repeatedly interrupted and reoriented by the sound of bells or simply by communal habit, calling him away from his careful copying to join his fellow monks in prayer, before returning afterward to pick up exactly where he had left off. Imagine the simplicity of his meals, likely a modest diet built around grains such as teff, a small, nutrient-dense grain native to the Ethiopian highlands and still central to Ethiopian cuisine today, prepared as a fermented flatbread called injera, along with legumes, vegetables, and on days when monastic dietary rules permitted it, perhaps small amounts of meat or dairy, eaten communally, with hands rather than utensils, in a manner still recognizably continuous with Ethiopian eating customs practiced today. Imagine, too, the particular quality of cold that would have settled over the monastery each evening, at that considerable elevation, a cold requiring genuine layered clothing, likely simple woven cotton or wool garments, and the welcome, gathering warmth of a shared evening fire, before the whole community retired in near total darkness to sleep and rise again before dawn the following day, to begin the entire cycle once more. I want you to sit for a moment with the sheer scale of dedication this whole system represents, multiplied across not just one scribe or one monastery, but across many generations of monks, in many different monastic communities scattered across the Ethiopian highlands, over more than 1,000 years of continuous transmission. Nobody involved in this long chain of copying could have known, with any certainty, that their specific labor would eventually matter to anyone beyond their own immediate religious community. They were not preserving this text for future scholars in Europe, or for a channel like this one, recorded and shared centuries later through technology entirely unimaginable to them. They were copying it, generation after generation, because their own tradition had told them it was scripture, worthy of exactly the same careful, reverent treatment given to the Psalms or the Gospels, and that conviction alone, sustained patiently across more than a millennium, by monks whose individual names have almost entirely been lost to us, is the entire reason we're able to sit together tonight and explore this ancient story at all. There's something in that fact I find worth carrying with us as we finally begin to bring this long evening to its close. So much of what survives from the ancient world survives not because of any single dramatic event or decision, but because of exactly this kind of patient, largely anonymous, repeated human labor, small, careful, unglamorous acts of preservation, performed by people who mostly never knew whether their effort would ultimately matter to anyone at all, carried out simply because it seemed like the right and necessary thing to do, one manuscript, one generation, one flickering oil lamp at a time, Enoch's journey through the gates of heaven. Before we close this long evening together, I want to take you back to Enoch himself one more time, because there's a piece of his story we haven't touched yet, and it's some of the strangest, most genuinely imaginative material anywhere in the entire ancient text, sitting in a section scholars call the astronomical book, alongside related material scattered through the Book of Dream Visions. According to this material, Enoch's 300 years of walking with God, that quiet, mysterious gap we discussed all the way back in our second chapter, involved a great deal more than simple companionship. The text describes the angel Uriel taking Enoch on an extended tour through the structure of the cosmos itself, showing him, in careful, almost technical detail, the movements of the sun and moon, the gates through which they rise and set, and the underlying order the text believes governs the entire visible sky. I want you to imagine what it might have meant to a person living in the ancient world we've spent all night imagining together, to receive an explanation like this one. Remember, this is a world with no artificial light competing with the night sky, where the movement of the sun and moon and stars would have been observed, night after night, year after year, with a level of close, sustained attention that's genuinely difficult for most of us to replicate today, living as we do surrounded by electric light and glowing screens that have made the actual night sky, for most people in the modern world, something we barely notice at all anymore. For the ancient audience of this text, questions about why the sun rose in a slightly different place each morning across the seasons, why the moon's visible shape changed steadily across each month, why the length of daylight stretched and shrank across the year, were not abstract scientific curiosities. They were urgent, practical questions, directly tied to planting and harvest, to religious festivals, to the entire rhythm of communal and agricultural life. The astronomical book describes an elaborate system involving 12 gates through which the sun passes across the course of a year, 6 on the eastern horizon and 6 on the western, moving through them in careful sequence as the seasons progress, and a separate, related system tracking the moon's own more rapid cycle. It lays out, with real, careful specificity, a calendar based on this system, dividing the year into 364 days, organized into 12 months, an arrangement that differs in interesting ways from other calendar systems used elsewhere in the ancient Near East, and one that some scholars believe reflects a genuine, distinct priestly or scribal tradition within ancient Judaism, concerned specifically with calculating religious festivals and observances with precise, reliable accuracy, independent of the more common lunar-based calendar systems used more broadly across the region. I find something worth sitting with in the fact that this material exists at all, tucked away inside a text otherwise so dominated by dramatic, unsettling stories of fallen angels and ravenous giants. It tells us something important about what the ancient authors and audiences of this text actually valued, and about how thoroughly they understood the study of the heavens and the preservation of moral and religious teaching to belong together, as part of a single, unified project, rather than as separate, unrelated categories of concern. Enoch's authority to warn later generations about coming judgment, in the text's own internal logic, comes from the exact same source as his authority to describe the precise, orderly movement of the sun and moon through their appointed gates. Both kinds of knowledge, moral and cosmic, are understood as having been shown to him directly. During those 300 mysterious years, the book of Genesis passes over in near total silence. The text also describes Enoch being shown the ends of the earth itself, in a series of visionary journeys that read, to modern eyes, almost like an ancient attempt at cosmic geography. He's shown storehouses for the winds, chambers holding the sun and moon in reserve, and the specific locations in the text's imagined cosmic architecture, where the spirits of the dead await final judgment, divided, according to the text, into different compartments depending on the moral character of the life they had lived. He's shown, too, a great tree, associated with a coming age of blessing still to unfold in the future, and in a detail that connects this material directly back to the judgment scene we spent time with earlier in tonight's story, the specific place of imprisonment prepared for the watchers themselves, along with the fiery abyss reserved for their final punishment on a day of judgment still, from the perspective of the text's own internal timeline, yet to come. I want you to imagine for a moment what it would have taken for a scribe working within this tradition, centuries before Christ, to actually compose material like this, drawing on whatever combination of careful astronomical observation, inherited religious tradition, and genuine, disciplined imaginative effort was available to them. In a world with none of the instruments or accumulated scientific knowledge that would eventually allow later astronomers to understand the actual mechanics of a solar system far larger and stranger than anything this text imagines. There's a real intellectual seriousness to this material, however unfamiliar its underlying cosmology feels to us now. A genuine, sustained attempt to systematically describe the order underlying the visible universe, motivated by the same basic human impulse that drives scientific inquiry in any era. The conviction that the world, however strange and overwhelming it might seem, is not simply chaotic, that some deeper, comprehensible order runs beneath its surface, waiting to be carefully observed, described, and understood. It's worth remembering, too, that this material sits alongside and is preserved within the very same manuscript tradition as the story of the Watchers and the Nephilim we've spent most of tonight exploring together. To the ancient audience of this text, these weren't separate, unrelated bodies of knowledge, one mythic and dramatic, the other careful and observational. They belonged together, as part of a single, coherent vision of a world governed, ultimately, by a single, comprehensible divine order, an order that the Watchers had violated through their dissent and their teaching, and that the careful, ordered movement of sun and moon through their appointed gates continued to demonstrate and uphold, even as human affairs on the ground below grew increasingly chaotic and violent in the years leading up to the flood. What this old story still asks of us. We've covered a great deal of ground tonight, so let's slow all the way down now and gather it together gently, the way you might bank a fire before finally going to sleep. We began on a real mountain, Hermon, still standing today, where an ancient text tells us 200 angelic beings bound themselves together with an oath before descending into the ordinary, everyday world of ancient farmers and mothers and grinding stones we spent our very first chapter imagining together. We followed the strange, unsettling story that grew from that descent, forbidden knowledge passed down through illegitimate channels, children grown to a size and hunger the world had never needed to accommodate before, and a slow, escalating catastrophe that the text tells us eventually required nothing less than a complete and careful judgment, rendered by 4 archangels acting under specific, deliberate instruction, each punishment matched precisely to the shape of its corresponding transgression. We sat with Noah, not as a distant, cartoonish figure herding cheerful animals 2 by 2, but as an old man living inside a genuinely difficult, isolating moral position, spending well over a century of an already extraordinarily long life on a project that must have looked, to nearly everyone around him, like the clearest possible evidence of a mind come completely unmoored from reality, felling and shaping an almost unimaginable quantity of timber by hand, warning neighbors who by every indication simply refused to listen, and finally sealing himself, his wife, his 3 sons, and his 3 sons' wives inside a vessel with what the text describes as a truly enormous variety of animal life, for a confinement that stretched on, according to the fuller chronology, well over a year. We followed the actual, true history of the book that preserves so much of this story's fuller detail, a text nearly lost entirely to the wider world, kept alive instead through more than 1,000 years of patient, largely anonymous labor by monks in the Ethiopian highlands, brought back into wider awareness almost by accident through the travels of a restless 18th century Scottish adventurer, and finally confirmed as genuinely, authentically ancient through fragments discovered in desert caves near the Dead Sea, in a story that, according to popular telling at least, began with nothing more dramatic than a boy chasing after a lost goat. And we spent some time, too, sitting honestly with the genuine scholarly uncertainty running through parts of this story. The real, long-standing debate over how exactly to read that single, ambiguous phrase in Genesis, sons of God, a debate that has occupied careful, sincere religious thinkers for well over 2,000 years without ever fully resolving into total consensus, and the wider pattern, stretching from Mesopotamia to Greece, to cultures scattered across the globe with no plausible historical contact with the ancient Near East at all, of human communities independently reaching for remarkably similar stories to process remarkably similar fears, about power obtained illegitimately, about violence that outgrows any community's capacity to contain it, and about whether hope for a genuine new beginning can survive even the most total kind of devastation. I don't think it's my place, on a channel like this one, built around slow, quiet, honest history rather than argument or persuasion, to tell you what to personally believe about any of this, whether you understand the Watchers as literal beings who once genuinely walked among ancient human communities, or as a rich, ancient metaphor developed by thoughtful, imaginative people trying to make sense of real historical catastrophe and real human moral failure through the storytelling tools available to them. What I do think is worth sitting with, regardless of where you personally land on that question, is just how much genuine, careful human effort has gone into preserving and grappling with this story across the many centuries, separating its earliest telling from the moment you're listening to it right now, drifting, I hope, somewhere towards sleep. There's something quietly remarkable, I think, in the fact that a farmer standing in a field somewhere in the ancient Fertile Crescent, watching the first blacksmith's forge appear in his village, wondering, however faintly, whether some of the new knowledge reshaping his world had arrived through entirely legitimate means, was wrestling with a version of a question we still, in our own very different world, continue to wrestle with today. Whenever some new and genuinely transformative piece of knowledge or technology arrives faster than our collective wisdom about how to use it responsibly seems able to keep pace, the specific form of that anxiety has changed enormously across the intervening centuries. The underlying human experience of it, watching the world shift beneath your feet faster than you feel equipped to fully understand, has perhaps not changed nearly as much as we might like to think. And there's something worth sitting with, too, in the patient, unglamorous, largely anonymous labor of the monks we spent time with in our previous chapter, working by lamplight in a remote highland monastery, copying letter by careful letter, generation after generation, a text they had no way of knowing would eventually reach an audience like the one listening tonight. Gathered from homes and beds and quiet rooms scattered across an entire world, those monks could barely have imagined existed beyond their own mountains. Their labor asked for nothing in return beyond the simple, sustained conviction that some things are worth preserving carefully, even when you cannot see, and will never see, exactly who might eventually benefit from that preservation. I think that's a fitting note to rest on, as we finally let this long story go for the night. A mountain, an oath, a flood, and running quietly beneath all of it, an enormous, patient chain of human hands, farmers and scribes and monks and translators and scholars, each one doing their own small part across more than 2,000 years to make sure this particular old story survived long enough to be told to you tonight, slowly, gently, by firelight, on your way toward whatever rest is waiting for you. I want to thank you sincerely for spending this long, quiet stretch of your evening here with me. If you're still awake at this point, and honestly, if you're not, that's exactly what this channel is built for. I hope this story gave your mind somewhere calm and interesting to rest, somewhere far enough from the ordinary worries of the day to let sleep finally find you. If you're new here, this is the quiet past, and what we do most nights is exactly this: long, honest, unhurried history, told without any rush toward a dramatic conclusion, meant to be listened to with the lights low and your eyes closed more often than open. If that sounds like something you'd want more of, I'd be genuinely grateful if you considered subscribing. It's a small thing on your end, but it makes a real difference for a channel like this one. And it means these stories will keep finding their way to you, night after night, whenever you need them. Before I let you go entirely, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it actually is where you are right now. Whether you're settling in for the night in a quiet house somewhere in the American Midwest, or it's already crept past midnight on the other side of the world, or you're one of the many of you I know listen during a long overnight shift or a late drive somewhere. I read every comment, even the ones that come in well after most of the world has gone to sleep, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's story, whichever way you personally read that old, ambiguous line about the sons of God. For now, though, let the fire in your mind burn down low. Let the mountain and the oath and the long, patient work of all those anonymous hands settle quietly into the back of your thoughts, the way old stories are meant to settle gradually, gently, without any hurry at all. Sleep well, and I'll see you again next time, right here in the quiet past.